I found two armed HOA cops standing in the middle of my vineyard at sunrise. Problem is, I'm not in their HOA, not even close. 3 days later, drones appeared over my house. Then came the hacking attempts, and a fake sheriff named Greg swearing he had jurisdiction over my land. So, I set a trap, one built specifically for his ego, and when Greg showed up screaming, slicing open a bag he swore was full of drugs, it exploded in his face. That's when the handcuffs finally came out. Sunrise has a particular way of touching my land, slow, warm, almost apologetic, like it's stepping softly through the vines so it doesn't wake anything before its time. That morning was no different. The sky was a quiet wash of gold, and the rows of Cabernet leaves shimmered with dew that looked like someone had dusted the world with broken glass. It was peaceful, the kind of peaceful a man learns not to take for granted once he's lived long enough. I'd just finished tightening the trellis wire along the south row, listening to the soft crackle of dry earth waking under my boots, when I caught something out of place. A shape. Two shapes, actually. Dark silhouettes standing dead center in my vineyard, as if they owned the place. At first, I thought maybe they were hikers lost off the trail, or some early morning bird watchers who took a wrong turn. But hikers don't move like that, like they're clearing corners, and bird watchers sure as hell don't carry sidearms. I froze there for a moment, one hand resting on the post, letting my eyes adjust. Two men, matching uniforms, dark navy, not quite police, not quite security, guns on their hips, cheap holsters, straps positioned the wrong way. And on their sleeves, the stupidest thing I've seen in all my years. A patch shaped like a badge, except instead of a star or an eagle, it had a little printed pine tree, and the words, Lakeside Bluffs Community Enforcement Unit. Community Enforcement Unit. I almost laughed. Instead, I felt my jaw tighten. Because Lakeside Bluffs, the HOA those patches belonged to, sat a quarter-mile down the road, tucked behind its perfect wooden signs and its pastel houses and its strict bylaws about garage paint color. My land wasn't part of them, had never been, and never would be. I stepped forward, boots crunching softly in the dirt, and the two of them finally turned as if noticing me for the first time. One lifted a clipboard. The other adjusted his belt like he wanted me to see the gun he probably wasn't even certified to carry. "Morning," the tall one said. Sunglasses, square jaw, hair trimmed military short. Except his stance was wrong. He was leaning too far forward, knees stiff. A man might read that as confidence. I read it as someone trying to look like something he wasn't trained to be. "What are you doing on my land?" I asked. The tall one smiled the way someone smiles when they think paperwork protects them. "Routine perimeter inspection," he said, "part of the HOA safety initiative." I stood there a second, letting the words settle like smoke. Then I did laugh, quiet, genuine disbelief. "This land isn't HOA," I said. "Never has been, never will be." The two exchanged a look, not the embarrassed kind, no. It was the kind men share when they think the person in front of them doesn't understand how the world really works. "Sir," the tall one said again, "your property borders the community. That grants us secondary jurisdiction for safety reviews." "Secondary jurisdiction," I repeated. "Is that what they're calling trespassing these days?" His smile faded, but his partner stepped forward, tapping a button on the chest of his vest, like he was activating a body cam. Except the body cam was off-brand, strapped on backward, and had a blinking red light that meant it wasn't recording at all. These men weren't cops. They were actors who didn't know their lines. I felt something old in me stir, something I thought I'd hung up years ago. The part of me that used to walk into rooms full of people lying to my face and had to figure out who was going to make the evening news and who was going to make court in the morning. I didn't introduce myself, didn't tell them who I used to be, didn't need to. I simply pointed toward the gravel drive. "Out," I said. "Now." The tall one blinked, surprised I wasn't playing whatever little authority game he expected. "Sir, refusal to cooperate could—" "Out," I repeated, this time sharper. He opened his mouth again, but I stepped forward first. One slow step. The kind that says this conversation just ended. Both men hesitated. Then, finally, they turned and walked off my property, muttering something about documentation and non-compliance. When they reached the road, they paused, as if waiting to see if I'd look away. I didn't. Not until they were gone. I exhaled slowly. In my lifetime, trouble rarely announces itself with sirens. It arrives quietly. Soft steps, forced smiles, men pretending to be something they're not. And as the sun reached over the treetops, warming the tops of the vines, I couldn't shake the feeling that those two weren't the beginning of something. No, they were the warning, the first ripple before the storm. I didn't expect to see those fake cops again, not so soon at least. But trouble doesn't like to travel alone. It brings friends. And it brought me one in particular. 2 days after the inspection, I was tightening a wooden brace near the front gate when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Slow, heavy, too heavy for a sedan, too slow for delivery trucks. That left one thing, someone trying to look important. I straightened up, wiped the dust off my palms, and watched an aging silver Tahoe crawl to a stop just outside my property line. The engine stayed running. The driver door opened with that creak older American SUVs make when they have lived through a few too many summers. A man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, built like someone who had once been in shape and refused to admit he wasn't anymore. Aviator sunglasses, jacket with a faded sheriff's department patch still clinging by 2 loose threads, as if the jacket itself couldn't decide whether to retire. He didn't look at the Vineyard first. He looked at me. The kind of look a man gives when he's gauging whether he should try intimidation or skip straight to domination. He walked toward the gate with a deliberate heaviness, boots thudding in the dirt. Halfway there, I noticed something telling. His right hand hovered near his hip every few steps. Old habit, cop habit. Except the way he held that hand, it was all wrong, too stiff, too rehearsed, like a man trying to remember a role he hadn't played well, even back when he still had a badge. "Morning," he said, stopping just short of the fence. His voice was gravel wrapped in smoke. I nodded. "Help you with something?" He smiled, thin, crooked, like he'd practiced it in the rearview mirror. "Name's Greg Wallace. I'm the community enforcement captain for Lakeside Bluffs." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him, letting the title sit there long enough for both of us to taste how ridiculous it sounded. "Community enforcement captain," I repeated, keeping my face straight. "That's something they print on business cards?" His jaw twitched, just a little. I'd struck a nerve, which told me something more useful than any introduction he could have given me. He cleared his throat. "Your land borders our community. That places you under secondary HOA jurisdiction in the event of an emergency or safety concern." There it was again. Jurisdiction, the favorite word of men who no longer have any. "My land isn't HOA," I said calmly. "Not yours, not anyone's, never has been." Greg leaned forward slightly, one hand resting on the metal gate like he might just push it open if he felt inclined. "You're close enough," he said. "Close enough that what happens here affects us, which means I get to take a look around when I need to." I stared at his hand on my gate before meeting his sunglasses square on. "That gate doesn't open for HOA fantasy titles," I said. "Only real law enforcement." He didn't like that. His mouth twitched, his shoulders tightened. He straightened his jacket like he used to do before stepping out of a patrol car, except this time, there was no badge, no authority, just muscle memory and a bruised ego. "You refusing an official safety inspection?" he asked. "I'm refusing a man in knockoff authority gear pretending to have power on my land," I replied. For the first time, Greg pushed his sunglasses up onto his forehead. His eyes were pale, sharp, and angry, the kind of angry that didn't come from this moment alone, the kind of angry that lived in a man long before he ever stepped foot on my property. I'd seen that look before, in interrogations, in interviews, in men who felt the badge slipping out of their hands and couldn't accept the loss. He exhaled through his nose. "Fine," he said, "but if something happens out here, anything, you remember I tried to keep things safe." "Safe for who?" I asked. He didn't answer. He turned, walked back to his Tahoe, and climbed in without another word. The door slammed, the engine revved, and the tires spat gravel behind him as he drove off faster than a man needing to prove a point should. I stood there a long minute after he left, hands resting on the gate. I'd dealt with liars, bullies, manipulators, and wannabe heroes in my time, but there was something different about Greg, something unhinged just beneath the surface. Not stupidity, not incompetence, something else. A man who lost real authority and had found a new playground to pretend he still had it. And I had the unsettling sense, deep in my bones, that Greg Wallace wasn't finished with me, not by a long shot. Greg didn't come back the next day. He didn't have to. Men like him don't knock twice. They let the echoes do the work. 2 mornings after his little visit, I was fixing the hinge on my workshop door when a sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly up my driveway. The sight of a real patrol car didn't bother me. Law enforcement had been on my property plenty of times over the years, usually for a glass of water or a lost dog report from a neighbor. But the way this one stopped, the way the officer stepped out with his shoulders already dropped and an apologetic look already forming, told me this wasn't a social call. He adjusted his hat, cleared his throat, and said, "We got a report about a possible weapons violation on the premises." I stared at him a moment. On my premises? He nodded like a man walking into a conversation he'd rather not be having. Caller said there were firearms stored in public view. Thought it might pose a risk to the neighborhood. I almost asked if the caller's name rhymed with Greg, but the officer looked uncomfortable enough already. Instead, I walked him to the workshop, pointed through the window. Inside, against the far wall, was my locked, bolted steel gun cabinet, visible only if you stood at a precise angle outside and squinted through the glass. The officer took one look and sighed. "Yeah," he muttered, "that's not a violation at all." "I know," I said. He apologized, sincerely, said he'd file it as a non-issue, said he hoped it wouldn't happen again. It happened again. 48 hours later, this time the call was about a strong alcohol odor drifting into the neighborhood. A strong alcohol odor. I live on a vineyard. Wine is literally airborne here in the summer. Same officer, more apologetic than before. We both stood in the driveway, listening to the hum of bees and the quiet of the morning, and he ran a hand over his face like he was trying to rub away secondhand embarrassment. "Look," he said, voice low, "I'm gonna level with you. Somebody's messing with you." I nodded. "I have a pretty good guess who." He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He left, rolling away slow, his tires cutting long lines in the dust. For a moment, I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that the nuisance calls were just Greg's lazy attempt at needling me, the way some men throw rocks at a fence to hear the dogs bark. But bullies with a badge, or a badge-shaped fantasy, rarely stop at rocks. They escalate. And escalation came quietly, the way trouble always seems to. I started noticing shadows where shadows shouldn't be. Footprints near the fence line. A new HOA truck parked a little too long down the road. Neighbors walking their dogs suddenly veering closer to my property, glancing at my house with an expression that wasn't quite curiosity, but wasn't friendliness either, like they'd been told a story. One where I played the villain. Then the mail started. Folded flyers slipped into my box. Printed warnings about neighborhood safety concerns. One even claimed my property had non-compliant agricultural operations. Non-compliant agricultural operations. On a vineyard I'd operated legally for years. I began documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, videos. An old habit, resurfacing like a scar catching the light. And somewhere inside me, a switch flipped. This wasn't random harassment anymore. This was a pattern. Directed. Coordinated. Intentional. Greg wasn't just poking around on a power trip. He was building something, painting a picture of me as a threat, a problem, a man who needed to be managed. Maybe he thought the pressure would make me bend. Maybe he thought enough false complaints would send me knocking on the HOA's door, hat in hand, asking how to make all this go away. He didn't know me. He didn't know that I'd spent years as a detective listening to men tell stories they hoped were believable. Stories they hoped would hide what they were really doing. Greg had that look. The look of someone trying way too hard to make his version of reality stick. And when a man like that doesn't get the reaction he wants, he doesn't back off. He doubles down. And as I walked the fence line that evening, the sun dipping behind the hills and the vines rustling softly in the wind, I felt it. Deep, certain, and cold. Greg Wallace had just gotten started. And what he wanted was control. He wasn't going to get it, but he was damn sure going to try. I've always believed every property has its own kind of silence. Mine used to sound like wind through vines, the creak of old wood, and the distant hum of cicadas. But by the end of that week, there was something else in the quiet, a feeling, like the land was being watched. Not the kind of watched where someone stands at your fence, the kind where someone is watching you, watching them. I first noticed it on a Tuesday evening, just after sunset. The sky still had a thin line of amber across the ridge, and I was carrying a coil of drip line back to the shed when something caught a glint of fading light. A metallic blink, high up. I stopped mid-step, tilted my head. There it was again. A tiny twinkle, like a star out of place. But stars don't mount themselves to a utility pole. I walked toward it slowly, boots crunching gravel, my breath calm and steady. Rage makes you sloppy, and lawyers take too long. Up close, the star resolved into a small, outdoor-rated bullet camera, mounted higher than any homeowner would bother to go. Industrial screws, cable stapled neatly down the pole, and on the side, a sticker. The same little pine tree logo I'd seen on those fake uniforms. Lakeside Bluffs Community Oversight Initiative. What a joke. I didn't touch it, didn't yank it down. Instead, I climbed the fence rail, steadying myself, and held my phone up to capture the serial number etched into the bracket. Then I stepped back, changed angles, and photographed the wiring path. Tools of my old trade. Evidence gathering. Clean, controlled, quiet. On the way back to the house, a breeze stirred the western trees, just a soft push of air, and the leaves moved just enough for me to see it. A second camera, half hidden in the branches, pointed directly at my porch. That one wasn't HOA issued. Different brand, smaller, cheaper, private purchase. Greg's taste, no doubt. I didn't have to guess who installed it. The angle, slightly downward, wide but not too wide, was exactly how a man who had spent too many years pretending to be tactical would place a camera. I stood there a full minute beneath it, not moving, just looking straight into the lens the way you stare down a man through a two-way mirror. Let whoever was on the other side feel that. Let them feel me seeing them. A third camera showed up the next day, wrapped in a cheap wildlife tracking shell, except wildlife cameras don't aim at patios, they aim at deer trails. This one stared right at where I drink my morning coffee. 5 eyes in total. 5 tiny points of light, blinking amber in the night whenever I stepped outside. So I made a habit of it. Every night, around 9, I sat on the porch with a mug in hand. Didn't matter if it was hot coffee or cold wine, point was ritual. I sat there, back straight, face calm, and simply looked at them. Most people are terrified of being watched, but watchers, real watchers, hate being acknowledged. It breaks their illusion of power. By Thursday, I was sure Greg was watching live feeds somewhere. Maybe his garage. Maybe a back room at the HOA office where he played sheriff after dark. Good. Let him watch. Around midnight, after one of these quiet standoffs, I went back inside and pulled up my router logs. Old habit, old instincts. At first glance, everything looked normal. My outdoor lights, my server, my phone. But buried in the list was a device with a MAC address I didn't recognize. Nothing labeled, no vendor tag, just a blank signature. It had connected for exactly 3 minutes at 2:14 a.m. And the next night, 2:16 a.m. And the next, 2:13 a.m. Consistent, patterned. Someone probing, not attacking, yet. Trying the door handle before they try the crowbar. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glow of the screen. Amateurs spy out of curiosity. Professionals spy for control. And Greg? Greg was confused enough to think he could be both. The vineyard creaked in the wind outside, vines brushing against each other like whispers. Another night, another silent challenge. And somewhere in the dark, behind a lens or a monitor, someone was watching. I closed the laptop softly. Let them watch. Because the more they watched, the more they would reveal. And I was taking notes. The thing about pressure is, it rarely arrives as a hammer. Most times, it starts as a knock, or in my case, 2 knocks. I heard the first one early Saturday morning. I was out by the arbor trimming an overgrown branch when the sound echoed from the front gate. Light, polite, too polite. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked up the path. 2 people stood there, a man and a woman, each wearing the kind of pastel polo shirt only HOA volunteers or real estate agents think looks authoritative. Clipboard in hand, smiles rehearsed, feet planted just shy of trespassing. "Good morning," the woman chirped, pronouncing each syllable like she was auditioning for a commercial. "We're here conducting our routine environmental compliance review." Environmental compliance review. I almost asked if they were lost on the way to the golf course. Instead, I rested my elbow on my gate and let the breeze carry the silence a few seconds longer than comfortable. "This property," I said finally, "is not part of Lakeside Bluffs." "Oh," she said brightly, as if she'd anticipated that line and had practiced her response. "Yes, we're aware. However, due to adjacent ecological risk," I held up a hand. "Stop." Their smiles froze. "You have 5 seconds," I said calmly, "to step off my property line and keep walking." At 6 seconds, I stopped being polite. The man blinked. The woman swallowed. Both stepped back without waiting for second number 2. They retreated down the road in a hurry, pastel polos fading into the distance like melting sherbet. But their presence wasn't the point. They hadn't come to inspect anything. They'd come to test the boundaries, to see how far they could lean before I leaned back. They got their answer. But just as the wind never blows from one direction forever, HOA pressure never arrives from only one angle. The second knock came that afternoon. Not on my gate this time, on my piece. I just sat down with a glass of cold Sauvignon Blanc when that wind shifted again. A shadow crossed my porch. No knock, no greeting, just a presence. And there he was, Greg Wallace, standing on the county sidewalk like a gargoyle waiting for permission to breathe fire. Arms crossed, jaw tight, sunglasses on even though the sun had dipped behind the hills. He didn't say anything at first, didn't need to. He just stood there, letting me see that he had watched the volunteers retreat, like a general inspecting the battlefield after scouts report back. "Your attitude," he finally said, "is causing problems." "For who?" I asked. "For the community." "That community isn't mine. It affects you." "No," I corrected. "You're affecting me." That made his nostrils flare. A full quiet second ticked by. Then he stepped forward, still technically on public ground, but close enough that I could smell the faint trace of peppermint he used to mask stale coffee breath. "These inspections," he said, "they're going to keep happening until you cooperate. I don't cooperate with trespassers. You don't get to choose." I raised my glass slightly, as if toasting the stupidity of that statement. "Greg," I said softly, "a man who thinks he has authority is one thing. A man who needs authority, that's something else entirely." His jaw snapped shut. The remark hit him deeper than he expected, probably because it was true. He took a step back, pointed at my land, and said, "We'll be back, and next time, it won't be volunteers." He walked off, boots thudding like punctuation marks. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that I wasn't watching him go. I was watching the phone in his hand, the way he kept checking it, the way he tilted it toward his chest to hide the screen, the way his thumb hovered just above the edge, like someone messaging him instructions in real time. And then it hit me. Greg wasn't acting alone. He wasn't planning. He was following. Someone else was pulling strings. Someone who understood bureaucracy better than Greg ever could. Someone who had something to lose. That suspicion turned into certainty. That evening when I checked my mailbox, sitting inside, perfectly folded, perfectly centered, was a letter printed on thick HOA stationery. Embossed logo, gold trim, signature at the bottom, Karen Manning, HOA President. The contents? A masterpiece of euphemistic garbage. Due to geographic adjacency and increased safety concerns, your property has been provisionally designated within Lakeside Bluffs' expanded observation perimeter. Cooperative compliance is expected. Non-invasive assessments may occur as needed. Translation: we made up a perimeter, you're inside it, and we're coming. I didn't crumple the letter, didn't curse, didn't call a lawyer. I simply folded it once, slid it into my evidence drawer, and poured myself another half glass of wine, because now I knew the truth. Greg wasn't the storm. He wasn't even the thunder. He was just the wind, the kind that blows right before the sky cracks open, and the crack was coming. The night everything changed wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't even start with a sound. It started with a shadow. A soft one, barely a ripple across the eastern row of vines. I was closing the tool shed, hand still on the lock, when I caught it from the corner of my eye. A figure crouched low, moving with just enough caution to tell me he thought he was being careful. I didn't shout, didn't reach for the light switch. Years as a detective taught me one rule. If someone wants to think they're unseen, let them. They show you more that way. By the time I reached the fence line, the figure was gone, slipped back over the ridge toward the road, but he had left something behind. Jammed halfway into the side panel of my exterior security camera was a small black USB stick. Cheap plastic, no markings, no label. The kind of tool amateurs think professionals use. I didn't touch it with my fingers. Pulled a pen from my pocket and levered it out gently, letting it drop onto a clean cloth. Back inside the house, I powered up my old investigation laptop, the one with no Wi-Fi card, no Bluetooth, and no mercy for malware. I plugged the USB in. What popped up made my jaw tighten, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Malware, crude but dangerous if you didn't know what you were looking at. A program meant to disable local cameras, reroute feeds to a third-party server, overwrite recordings, and allow remote live access. It wasn't designed by someone smart, just someone cocky. Greg. It had his fingerprints all over it, even if there weren't any physical prints. Most people in my position would have deleted it, reset their system, maybe called a lawyer, but fury makes you sloppy, and lawyers take too long. So, instead of shutting the door, I opened it wider. Right then, the honeypot took shape. Clean, simple, elegant. A trap tailored to Greg's ego. He wanted to see something incriminating, then I'd give him something he couldn't resist. I spent the next morning preparing the stage. I positioned a few crates near the back of the shed, stacked just so. Had my Vineyard assistant Toby help me lift a couple heavy bags onto the tailgate of the truck. We talked in low voices, loud enough for a microphone from a hacked camera to catch, quiet enough to sound private. The bags were filled with powdered yeast nutrients, white as snow, high-grade organic fertilizer, and sealed boxes of specialty wine reagents, completely legal, totally harmless. But under the right lighting, they looked like contraband. Then, just as the sun dipped low, we ran the scene. I made sure the hacked camera had a perfect angle. I stepped into frame, lifted one of the bags, and said, deliberately, casually, "Make sure these go before sunrise. We don't want anyone asking questions about that white powder." Toby caught on instantly. Smart kid. He nodded, playing along like he'd done this 100 times. "Got it, boss. No one will see a thing." Perfect. I didn't overdo it. That's where amateurs fail. Greg wasn't looking for Hollywood. He was looking for something to confirm the story he already wanted to believe. A few half-heard phrases, dim lighting, suspicious movements. That's catnip for a man like him. When we finished, I locked the shed, killed the porch light, and let the cameras do the rest. Around midnight, the hacked feed came alive. I didn't need to see the monitor on Greg's end. I could imagine his face perfectly. Widened eyes, shallow breath, ego lighting up like a Christmas tree. The sudden thrill of thinking he'd uncovered something huge. Greg wanted a victory. A big one. Something that would make him feel like a sheriff again, instead of a bored HOA heavy with a fake badge and a fading reputation. So, I gave him a crime, a fake one, a carefully staged one, and he bit. Hard. At 12:43 a.m., my router log flashed a new entry, a foreign device connected to my internal network. Same MAC signature as the past several nights, but this time, it stayed connected longer. 7 minutes, then 10, then 13. A man obsessed. Finally, at 1:02 a.m., the connection dropped. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet hum of the server fill the room. It was done. Greg had seen exactly what I wanted him to see. He would move next, and he would move too fast. Because men like Greg, men who crave authority after they've lost it, don't verify, don't double-check, don't think. They act. And when they act without thinking, they walk straight into the trap. My trap. The vineyard outside rustled softly in the night breeze. Somewhere out there, 5 blinking cameras stared into the darkness, believing they were the hunters. But the truth was simple. They weren't watching me. They were performing for me. Every step Greg took now, he would take with confidence. And confidence is the easiest weakness to exploit. There's a certain kind of knock that doesn't belong in the day. A night knock. Soft, uneasy, not meant to scare, meant to plead. I heard it around 10:47 p.m. Not the front door, not the porch, the side gate, the one no one ever uses unless they're lost or desperate. I set down my book, slid the safety off the porch light, and stepped outside. A figure stood just beyond the gate, one hand raised like he was afraid to put it down. Pastel HOA polo, breath quick, eyes darting down the road. Travis. I'd seen him before. Clipboard guy, mid-30s, always sweating through his collar at HOA meetings. The kind of man who wanted to blend in so badly he made himself conspicuous. He flinched when the porch light hit him. "Derek," he whispered, "can we talk?" I studied him a second. He wasn't here to pick a fight. He was shaking too much for that. I opened the gate and motioned him in. He stepped inside like he was crossing a border checkpoint. "What's going on?" I asked. He wrung his hands, actually wrung them, like a kid caught cheating on a test. "They're going too far," he said. "Greg, Karen, the whole damn board." I crossed my arms. "Define too far," he swallowed hard. "It's surveillance, more than you know, more than they told the residents." He looked like a man forcing himself to spit out poison. I stayed quiet, letting him speak. "Silence works better than pressure," he continued, voice trembling. "Greg's been watching your property for weeks, live monitoring. He's got a whole setup in his garage, screens, notes, files. I saw it. I wasn't supposed to, but he forgot to close the door all the way when I dropped off some paperwork. There it was, the first crack in the dam." "What kind of files?" I asked. "Everything," he whispered. "Schedules, screenshots from your cameras, logs, even notes about your visitors." I kept my breathing steady, but inside, a cold wire tightened. "And Karen?" I said. Travis looked around my porch like he expected someone to leap out of the shadows. "She knows," he said. "She pretends she doesn't, but she knows. And Greg has something on her, something bad." He hesitated, hand trembling at his side. "That's why I'm here." I didn't rush him. After a long moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and damp from sweat. He handed it to me with both hands, like it was radioactive. I unfolded it slowly. A password, a login URL, a note, internal cloud storage, do not delete. I looked up. He nodded frantically. "It's Karen's, the one she uses for HOA contracts, vendor bids, private emails. There are files in there that don't match the official records. Missing money, off-the-books payments, some of them go straight to Greg." A cold, quiet moment passed between us. He wasn't lying. He wasn't brave enough to lie this badly. I folded the paper neatly. "Travis," I said, "why bring this to me?" His answer was barely a whisper. "Because the rest of them, they listen to Greg. They're afraid of him, afraid of crossing him, afraid of what he'll do with whatever he's got on Karen. And you?" His throat tightened. "I'm afraid too. But I'm more afraid of where this is going. Greg's not stable, Derek. He talks like he still has a badge, like he's the sheriff of some frontier town. He thinks you're a threat, a danger to the community." I almost laughed. "I grow grapes," I said. Travis shook his head violently. "That's not how he sees it. He says you're non-compliant, unpredictable, potentially dangerous. He's building a case, a reason. He wants an incident, something big enough to justify intervention." He clenched his fists. "And Karen won't stop him, because he has leverage. She approved vendor bids last year, illegal ones, double payments, kickbacks. If that gets out, she loses everything. So she lets him do whatever he wants." A wind moved through the vineyard, rustling the leaves like a whispering crowd. I stared at the man in front of me, sweaty, terrified, trying to hold himself together. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even a brave man. But tonight, fear pushed him to honesty. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Travis blinked rapidly, as if he hadn't actually thought that far. "I want it to stop," he said. "I want someone to do something. And you're the only one Greg can't intimidate." I let out a slow breath. "Travis," I said quietly, "you just stepped into a very dangerous place." He nodded. "I know." Another gust of wind moved through the vines. "You need to go home," I said. "Act normal. Don't talk to anyone. Not a word. Not a hint." He swallowed hard. "And Derek?" "Yes?" "I never came here. You never saw me." I held his gaze. "For your sake," I said. That's exactly how it happened. He slipped out the side gate and vanished into the dark, his footsteps quick, almost frantic. I watched until the night swallowed him whole. Then I unfolded the paper again. The password sat there quietly. A key, a confession, a spark waiting for a match. Greg wasn't just watching me. He wasn't just harassing me. He was building a narrative. But now, I had the first thread that could unravel his entire web, and I intended to pull it. I've been raided before, real raids, federal warrants, drug houses. Those nights had a rhythm, shouted commands, boots hitting pavement, the metallic clatter of gear when adrenaline outruns caution. This raid didn't sound like any of that. It started with a strange stillness, almost peaceful. I was hosting a small evening BBQ, just 12 people, all friends or longtime clients, eating ribs under the arbor lights while blues music drifted softly from a speaker. The vines rustled in the warm night breeze. The fire pit snapped, glasses clinked. It was a good night, the kind of night I built my life around. Then the lights came, red and blue, washing over the Vineyard rows like the sky had suddenly started breathing lightning. 2 cruisers first. Then a black tactical van grinding down my driveway, kicking up dust like a storm of gravel. The music died. Every conversation died with it. My guests stepped back instinctively, hands raised slightly, eyes wide. I stayed still, watching the vehicles roll to a halt, watching the doors fling open, watching the officers pour out, hands hovering near their weapons like they'd been briefed for a cartel bust. One young cop stepped forward, voice trembling just enough for me to hear it, even over the engines. "Sir, we received a tip about illegal alcohol sales and possible narcotics activity on the property." Behind him, the tactical van door slid open, fast, and there he was, Greg, standing like a man ready to announce a promotion he hadn't earned. He pointed straight at me, shouting something to the officers I couldn't quite hear. Probably trying to play commander, trying to claim the raid as his idea, trying to catch the spotlight he'd been starving for all his life. I raised my hands just enough to show I was cooperative. Then I spoke calmly. "Officer, unless you're here for pulled pork and Merlot, you've been lied to." My guest snorted nervously, half fear, half disbelief. But the young officer wasn't the one who mattered now, because from the back of the group, pushing past 2 tactical guys, came a familiar face. Andy Morales. Smart, level-headed, the kind of cop you want on a dark call at 2 a.m. A man I trusted. His eyes scanned the scene. My friends, the food, the wine, the complete lack of chaos. Then he saw me. "Derek?" he blurted out. "What the hell?" "Ask your caller," I said. Andy turned to the officer beside him. "Who logged the tip?" "Anonymous," the officer replied, "but it came through internal channels, marked priority." Andy's eyebrows lowered. He knew exactly what that meant. And right then, Greg moved. He lunged forward toward the stack of covered barrels beside my shed. Barrels I had intentionally staged for the camera honeypot trap 3 nights earlier. Barrels Greg had watched through the malware his people smuggled into my cameras. He shoved past 2 officers, shouting, "It's in here! I saw him moving it! Open these damn bags!" "Greg, wait!" I barked. Too late. He grabbed a box cutter from his belt, jammed the blade into the top of the nearest canvas bag, and ripped downward with all his weight. A massive cloud of fine white powder blasted upward, straight into his face. It coated his hair, his clothes, his open mouth. He stumbled back, sputtering, coughing like he'd just inhaled a bakery. I stood with my arms crossed. "Careful, Greg," I said levelly. "That's premium fermentation yeast. You breathe too much of that, you'll end up growing mold in places you don't want to talk about." A few officers tried not to laugh. A few failed. Greg wiped at his face, smearing the white powder into streaks across his cheeks like some deranged clown. Rage contorted his features. "Arrest him!" he screamed, pointing at me with a trembling powder-covered hand. "He's hiding drugs! I saw the footage! I saw it!" Andy stepped forward. "What footage?" Greg froze, but only for a beat. The footage from his property cameras." Andy stared at him harder. "Greg, how would you have access to his private security feed?" No answer. Just the growing awareness spreading across the officers' faces. The silence deepened, thick enough to cut. "That's a felony, Greg." Andy's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Quiet authority hits harder. Greg stammered, waving his hands. I had authorization. HOA oversight. Emergency jurisdiction." "No, you did not," Andy said. 2 officers stepped closer to Greg, not aggressive, just ready. My guests watched, silent. The Vineyard hissed under the breeze. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough to be heard. "Greg, you walked into a trap. My trap. The only illegal thing here tonight is you." The powder on his face made him look ghostly, unhinged, defeated. Andy finally nodded to his men. "Cuff him." And just like that, the make-believe sheriff of Lakeside Bluffs, the man who thought he could bully, surveil, harass, manipulate, and control me, was marched across my vineyard under real police lights, hands bound, looking like a powdered donut with anger issues. My guests started breathing again. One of them whispered, "Holy hell." I exhaled slowly. The trap had sprung clean. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Greg wasn't working alone, and the person backing him was about to realize their turn was coming next. News travels fast in a small town. Scandal travels faster. By sunrise, everyone in Lakeside Bluffs knew Greg Wallace had been led away in handcuffs, looking like a powdered donut. But they didn't know why. They thought it was a misunderstanding, a mistake. I intended to correct that. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent the hours between 2 a.m. and dawn organizing the files Travis had given me, printing logs, highlighting bank transfers, blowing up screenshots of Greg's illegal surveillance feed until they were poster-sized. At 8 a.m., I didn't go to the police station. I went to the edge of my property, right where the public road meets the HOA entrance. I set up a simple folding table, a podium, and a sign that read, "HOA Safety, Update, the Truth." I invited 3 people specifically, the editor of the County Gazette, the sheriff's deputy, who hated Greg, and Travis. But I knew the rest would come on their own. And they did. Neighbors walking dogs, joggers, people driving by who slowed down to look. Within 20 minutes, I had a crowd of 40 people. I stood up. I didn't use a megaphone. I didn't need one. The silence was loud enough. "Morning," I said. "Most of you saw the lights last night. Most of you heard the rumors." I picked up the first poster board. It showed a grainy night vision photo of a bedroom window. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "This," I said, pointing to the image, "is the master bedroom of the Miller family, 3 streets over, taken 2 nights ago." Mrs. Miller, standing near the back, covered her mouth with her hand. "And this," I flipped the board, "is the timestamp, taken by a camera hidden in the community oak tree, installed by Greg Wallace, paid for by your HOA dues." The murmurs started instantly, angry, shocked. "Greg didn't just watch me," I continued, my voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. "He watched you. He built files on you. Who comes over, what time you leave, who you're sleeping with." I dropped a stack of papers on the table. Thud. "These are the logs, courtesy of an internal source who couldn't stomach it anymore." I saw Travis in the crowd, head down, wearing a hoodie. He gave me the tiniest nod. "But Greg is just the muscle," I said. "Muscle needs money." I picked up the second stack of papers, bank records. "Karen Manning," I said the name clearly. Across the street, inside the HOA office, I saw the blinds twitch. She was watching. Karen authorized security overtime payments of $4,000 a month to a consulting firm registered to Greg's wife. She authorized equipment upgrades that were actually kickbacks for vendor contracts. I held up the emails. Here she is, in her own words, telling Greg to, quote, "find dirt on the winemaker so we can seize his land for the expansion." The crowd wasn't murmuring anymore. They were shouting. People were turning toward the HOA office, pointing, pulling out phones. "This isn't a community," I said, looking straight at the office window where I knew she was hiding. "It's a piggy bank for a failed cop and a corrupt president." I stepped back from the podium. "The sheriff has these files. The state attorney has these files. And now, you have them." I left the papers on the table. By noon, 4 board members had resigned via email, claiming they had no knowledge of the operations. By 1 p.m., a news van from the city arrived. And by 3 p.m., I watched Karen Manning run out the back door of the community center, loading boxes into her trunk like a thief in the night. She thought she could outrun the paperwork. She was wrong. The trap had caught the rat. Now it was coming for the queen. There is a specific time of day that career criminals fear most. It's not midnight. Midnight is when they feel safe. Midnight is when they own the dark. No. The time they fear is 5 a.m., the hour of the wolf. The hour when sleep is deepest, defenses are lowest, and the warrant is signed. We called it Operation Light. I wasn't part of the stack that hit Greg's door. I'm a civilian now, my badge is in a drawer, but I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the convoy of unmarked black SUVs roll silently past my vineyard, turning left into Lakeside Bluffs. They didn't use sirens, not yet. Andy called me 10 minutes later to fill in the blanks. At 5:14 a.m., the state attorney's task force breached the front door of Greg Wallace's home. Greg didn't come out fighting. For all his bluster, for all his tactical talk and fake badges, when the real door kickers arrived, he crumbled. They found him in his hallway, wearing boxer shorts and a stained t-shirt, trying to shove a hard drive into a microwave. He didn't even get it turned on before he was on the ground, zip-tied, and read his rights. But the arrest wasn't the disturbing part. The search was. What they found inside that house turned this from a case of harassment into a nightmare. In Greg's garage, his command center, they found the server Travis had warned me about. But it wasn't just logs. It was a shrine, dozens of monitors, hard drives labeled by address, and on the wall, a map, a floor-to-ceiling map of Lakeside Bluffs and the surrounding area. Color-coded pins marked every house, blue for compliant, yellow for watch list. And right in the center, circling my vineyard, was a thick red marker line. Inside the circle, he'd scribbled one word, target, but it got worse. Inside the master bedroom closet, they found a cache of weapons that would make a cartel nervous. 3 AR-15s with filed-off serial numbers, a modified taser illegally ramped up to dangerous voltage, and a box of plastic restraints, flex cuffs, enough to detain a dozen people. He wasn't just playing sheriff. He was preparing for a war that only existed in his head. If I hadn't set that trap, if I hadn't triggered him early, God knows what he would have done with those zip ties. While the task force was dismantling Greg's life, another team was looking for the queen, Karen Manning. She hadn't gone home after the press conference. She'd run. But people like Karen, people who have lived their whole lives in a bubble of petty authority, don't know how to disappear. They don't know how to ditch a phone, or swap cars, or stay off the grid. They panic. At 6:45 a.m., a state trooper spotted a luxury Lexus speeding down the interstate, 50 miles from the state line. When they pulled her over, she didn't run. She locked the doors and screamed. She screamed that she was the president of the association. She screamed that this was a conspiracy. She screamed until the glass broke and they dragged her out. In the trunk, they found 2 suitcases. One was filled with clothes. The other was filled with $140,000 in cash. Money drained from the HOA's emergency repair fund just hours before the accounts were frozen. By 9 a.m., the sun was fully up over my vineyard. The SUVs were gone. The sirens had faded. My phone buzzed. A text from Andy. Short, professional. Both in custody. Evidence secured. It's over. I looked out at the rows of vines, stretching green and calm toward the horizon. The dew was drying on the leaves. The birds were singing. The watchers were gone. The cameras were dark. The shadow that had been hanging over my land for weeks had finally, completely vanished. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted better than it had in years. But I knew there was one act left. The arrest is just the beginning. The real end happens in a courtroom. And I intended to be in the front row. Courtrooms have a specific smell: floor wax, old wood, and nervous sweat. It's a smell I hadn't breathed in years. But walking into the county superior court that Tuesday morning, it felt like putting on an old coat. Heavy, familiar. The trial took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of jury selection. 3 weeks of expensive defense lawyers trying to paint Greg Wallace as an overzealous community guardian and Karen Manning as a victim of circumstances. They tried to make it about property lines. They tried to make it about zoning laws. But you can't argue with video. On the 4th day, the prosecution played the footage from the honeypot night. The courtroom was dead silent as the jury watched Greg on the large monitors. They saw him creeping through the dark. They saw him trespassing. They saw him hacking a private system. But the nail in the coffin wasn't the video, it was the audio. Travis, nervous, shaking Travis, took the stand, and he brought the recordings. The jury listened to Greg's voice, recorded in his own garage, bragging to a buddy on the phone. Once I plant the evidence, the winemaker is gone. Then we take the land. Karen's already got a buyer lined up for the expansion. Gasps rippled through the gallery. I sat in the front row, watching Greg's back. He didn't turn around. His shoulders were hunched. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the shrinking posture of a bully who realizes the teacher is finally watching. Karen refused to look at anyone. She stared at her hands, weeping silently, playing the part of the fragile old lady. It didn't work. Not after the forensic accountant took the stand and showed where the $40,000 in cash came from. It came from the neighborhood's roof repair fund, from the playground maintenance budget, from the pockets of the very people sitting behind me in the courtroom. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't look at the defendants. I looked at the jury. I told them about the drones, the cameras, the intimidation, the fear my neighbors felt seeing a fake police car parked outside their homes at midnight. A home is supposed to be a sanctuary, I told them. These two turned it into a prison. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the air in the room felt electric, that heavy, static silence that comes before a lightning strike. The judge, a stern woman who had zero patience for abuse of power, asked the foreman for the verdict. I watched Greg. He was trembling, actually trembling. On the charge of conspiracy to commit extortion, guilty. On the charge of aggravated stalking, guilty. On the charge of possession of unregistered firearms and modification of weapons, guilty. The list went on, 18 counts in total. Then came the sentencing. The judge looked over her glasses at Greg Wallace. "Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a razor, "you took an oath once as a police officer, and you lost it. Then, you created a fantasy world where you could abuse that power again. You terrorized this community, not for safety, but for ego. I sentence you to 24 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Greg's knees buckled. His lawyer had to hold him up. He let out a sound, half sob, half gasp, that echoed off the high ceilings. Then the judge turned to Karen. "Mrs. Manning, you were trusted to protect this community. Instead, you treated it as your personal bank account. You funded a private militia to harass an innocent man. I sentence you to 18 years. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay full restitution of $450,000 to the HOA funds." Karen wailed. It was a sharp, ugly sound. The sound of a life of privilege shattering against a concrete wall. But the judge wasn't finished. She banged her gavel once to silence the room, then looked at the remaining members of the HOA board sitting in the gallery. "Furthermore," she declared, "evidence has shown that the Lakeside Bluffs Homeowners Association has become a criminal enterprise. By court order, the current board is hereby dissolved immediately. An independent trustee will be appointed to manage the community until fair, monitored elections can be held." The courtroom erupted, not with anger, with applause. Real, sustained applause. My neighbors, people I'd barely spoken to for years, were hugging each other. Some were crying. The reign of terror was over. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out into the hallway. Andy was waiting for me. He didn't smile. He just nodded. "Justice?" he asked. I looked back at the heavy oak doors, where bailiffs were leading Greg and Karen away to their new lives in 6x8 cells. "Yeah," I said. "Justice." We walked out of the courthouse together, stepping into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The air tasted different out here, cleaner, lighter. It tasted like freedom. 6 months later. The silence returned to the vineyard, but it wasn't the heavy, watchful silence of before. It was the clean silence of growth, the silence of wind moving through heavy vines, the silence of a hawk circling high above, hunting for field mice, not for leverage. I spent the morning of the Harvest Festival walking the perimeter. The expanded observation zone was gone. The cameras in the trees, gone. I took the last one down myself, tossed it into the recycling bin, and watched the garbage truck crush it into scrap plastic. The drones don't fly anymore. The neighborhood has changed too. With the king and queen of Lakeside Bluffs serving federal time, the fear evaporated. People wave now, real waves, not the nervous, check who's watching waves. Travis was elected the new HOA president. He didn't want the job. He tried to run away when they nominated him. But that's exactly why he's perfect for it. He dismantled the enforcement committee on his first day. Now, the HOA worries about what it's supposed to worry about: pool maintenance and flower beds. I reached the front gate, the same gate where Greg had stood, and demanded my obedience. I drilled a new sign into the wood, solid oak, brass lettering. I made it myself. It reads, "Private property, cameras recording, Sheriffs by appointment only. No HOA jurisdiction beyond this point. I stood back and admired it. It wasn't a warning, it was a fact. By sunset, the tables were set under the arbor. This time, there were no flashing lights, no tactical vans, no screaming men covered in yeast, just friends, neighbors, even a few of the folks who used to be afraid to look at my house. The smell of slow-roasted pork and wood smoke filled the air. Bottles of my best reserve Cabernet were being uncorked. The sound of laughter, loud, genuine laughter, drifted up toward the stars. Andy Morales was there, off-duty, beer in hand, laughing with Travis about something. I watched them from the edge of the patio. A young couple from the neighborhood walked up to me. They were holding glasses of my wine. "We just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, for standing up. We didn't think anyone could stop them. I smiled. "Vines have deep roots," I said. "They don't pull up easy." As the night went on and the fire pit burned down to glowing embers, I tapped a spoon against my glass. The chatter died down. 50 faces turned toward me. I raised my glass. The deep red wine caught the firelight, glowing like a ruby. I looked at the land I loved. I looked at the people who were finally free to be neighbors again. "To freedom," I said, my voice carrying in the quiet night. "To boundaries." I paused, looking toward the empty road where Greg's Tahoe used to prowl. "And to the absolute pleasure of never letting small men play big cops." "Hear, hear!" Andy shouted. Glasses clinked. The sound rang out like a bell. I took a sip. It was the best vintage I had ever made. It tasted like victory.